If you are staring at your ceiling at 3 o'clock in the morning with a suffocating tightness in your chest and a mind that refuses to quiet down, please do not scroll away, because what you are about to hear is not another hollow cliche telling you to just stop worrying. There is a specific passage in ancient scripture that has been heavily weaponized against anxious souls for centuries, transforming a profound psychological sanctuary into a heavy burden of religious inadequacy. Countless exhausted individuals waking up in the dead of night find themselves trapped in a secondary loop of shame, wondering if their chronic panic and physical tremors are definitive proof of a defective faith. We have been handed a flawed prescription by well-meaning observers who tell us to simply pray harder or trust more, as if we had not already exhausted every ounce of our willpower trying to do exactly that. But there is a monumental secret buried within the history of this text that religious tradition rarely mentions to those who are suffering. The fragile man who originally penned these immortal words of absolute tranquility was not sitting in a serene garden or a peaceful study of a modern sanctuary. He was actually enduring a terrifying crisis, stripped of his freedom, and facing the immediate threat of execution inside a subterranean Roman dungeon. The profound genius of his message lies in the reality that he did not practice toxic positivity or psychological suppression of his terror. Instead, he developed an ancient mental roadmap designed to systematically intercept the brain's alarm system and redirect its frantic energy into an unbreakable internal fortress. If you can grasp the raw mechanics of this ancient mental roadmap over the next few minutes, the paralyzing cycle of overthinking that has governed your life for years will completely lose its authority over your future. We are deliberately stepping away from judgmental dogmas and simplistic theological lectures today to create a deeply compassionate therapeutic space where you can examine the biological reality of your own fear. To truly unlock the transformative power of this emotional antidote, we must first journey backward into the shadows to witness the exact environmental devastation that surrounded the man who designed it. Try to submerge your mind into the claustrophobic reality of a first-century Roman prison cell, where the air is thick with damp decay and the only consistent sound is the heavy clinking of iron chains against stone floors. This was the oppressive environment enveloping the Apostle Paul as he sat in profound social isolation, abandoned by his closest companions and completely betrayed by the communities he had dedicated his life to serve. The crushing weight of prolonged uncertainty regarding whether the next morning would bring a decree of release or a march to the executioner's block was a constant psychological assault. From the perspective of behavioral psychology, this type of chronic helplessness and absolute loss of environmental control is a direct, devastating attack on the human central nervous system. When a human being is trapped in an inescapably unpredictable environment, the brain's threat detection center triggers a perpetual cascade of stress hormones. This biological survival mechanism forces the mind to run hyper-vigilant calculations, projecting every conceivable worst-case scenario in a desperate attempt to manufacture a sense of safety. Paul was a flesh-and-blood human being whose nervous system experienced the exact same accelerated heart rate and tight chest cavity that paralyzes you when you face financial ruin or a devastating medical diagnosis. His psychological defenses were being systematically eroded by the relentless passage of silent hours and the agonizing awareness of his own vulnerability. Yet, in the absolute nadir of his physical and emotional exhaustion, he made a conscious decision not to succumb to the paralyzing numbness of despair. Instead, he picked up a parchment and inscribed an elegant four-word code that casual readers routinely misunderstand because they overlook the structural pivot that can instantly dismantle a panic attack. The foundational anchor point of our examination begins with the universally recognized phrase from Philippians chapter 4, verse 6, which demands that we should be anxious for nothing. When we scrutinize this text through a clinical lens, we immediately expose the counterproductive defense mechanism of emotional suppression that many readers fall victim to when facing this phrase. Consider a dedicated woman like Elena, who spent decades leading community groups and serving faithfully, yet found herself completely unable to step outside her front door due to agoraphobia and severe panic. When well-meaning peers flippantly hand someone in that state of biological crisis the phrase to be anxious for nothing, they inadvertently induce an overwhelming wave of secondary shame. The victim's brain processes this descriptive invitation as a punitive moral prohibition, creating a toxic feedback loop where they become intensely anxious about the very fact that they are feeling anxious. Paul was not acting as a spiritual police officer issuing a citation for the crime of worrying, nor was he dismissive of the agonizing reality of human fear. He was functioning as an expert strategist, diagnosing the fact that when the mind spins in perpetual circles trying to solve an unsolvable future, it drains the soul of its vital essence. The text does not command you to instantly freeze your emotions or leave your mind completely empty, which is a biological impossibility for a hyper-aroused nervous system. He introduces an essential single powerful word at the midpoint of the sentence that serves to structurally reroute the frantic blood flow away from the primal fear centers of the human brain. This small shift in the sentence brings us to the second anchor point of the scriptural cluster, which rests upon the phrase, "but in everything." This precise phrase introduces the clinical concept of redirection, which is paramount for anyone navigating contemporary anxiety disorders. Your brain possesses a finite amount of cognitive bandwidth, and the intense electrical energy driving your midnight panic is the exact same energy required for profound concentration. Instead of engaging in a futile, exhausting war to suppress or destroy that emotional current, Paul provides an explicit instruction to alter its destination. The character in this narrative is caught in a fierce internal tug-of-war between allowing the obsessive thoughts to loop indefinitely and actively objectifying the fear. By saying "but in everything," the text validates that no detail of your daily dread is too trivial or embarrassing to be dragged out of the dark and brought into an intentional space. But how does a shattered human being extract a paralyzing fear from their mind without merely escalating their desperation during the process of articulation? To discover the practical mechanism of this extraction, we must examine a raw historical case study preserved within the ancient pages of the Book of Psalms. This historical parallel introduces our third anchor point, which is the profound psychological crisis documented in Psalm 77 from verse 1 through verse 12. Here, the ancient writer Asaph provides an unvarnished clinical description of severe generalized anxiety disorder combined with trauma-induced insomnia. He explicitly states that his sore ran in the night without ceasing, that his soul refused to be comforted, and that he was so overwhelmed he could not speak. The initial defense mechanism deployed by Asaph is catastrophic withdrawal, accompanied by intense dread, as he openly questions if the Creator has permanently withdrawn his affection. This is the exact mental state of a modern individual who feels completely abandoned by light, believing that their mental health crisis is an indicator of cosmic rejection. The monumental breakthrough occurs in verse 11 when Asaph intentionally executes an abrupt interruption by stating, "I will remember the works of the Lord." This is not a superficial exercise in positive thinking or emotional denial, but a deliberate systematic retrieval of historical evidence from long-term memory. He forces his hyper-aroused brain to process cold, objective historical data regarding past survival and systemic faithfulness to counteract the distortions generated by his immediate panic. By introducing a massive competing truth into his current consciousness, he actively starves the anxiety loop of the unmonitored space it requires to survive. Once this anchor of deliberate memory is securely dropped into the subconscious, the brain begins to realize that the current storm does not possess the historical data to prove it will win. But what structural changes occur within the human personality when this anchor is firmly established while the external life circumstances remain entirely unchanged? This inquiry leads us directly to the fourth core anchor point of our study found in Philippians chapter 4 verse 7, which promises a peace that will guard your heart and mind. Let us look closely at the internal narrative of James, a meticulous corporate professional who structured his entire identity around the illusion of hyper-control. When his youngest son was suddenly diagnosed with a life-threatening neurological condition, James found himself trapped in a catastrophic environment that he could not manipulate or fix. His coping mechanisms disintegrated into absolute panic because his brain could not find a mathematical guarantee of a positive outcome. The profound peace that eventually entered his life was not a magical emotion that appeared because the medical prognosis was suddenly reversed. It was a state of crisis stabilization that occurred when he abandoned the exhaustive demand for certainty and allowed his core self to be anchored in a larger reality. This text uses a highly specific military term for guard, which describes an active garrison of Roman soldiers stationed at the gates of a vulnerable city to repel enemy invaders. The narrative reveals that true emotional resilience does not require the immediate removal of life's stressors, but the establishment of an internal psychological perimeter that prevents panic from breaching the soul. This protective state genuinely transcends human understanding because it violates basic evolutionary logic, allowing a person to breathe deeply while the storm is still raging at maximum velocity. Yet we must ask an incredibly vital question. Does this spiritual state of absolute surrender completely invalidate the biological realities of clinical mental illness and the necessity of scientific intervention? This crucial intersection brings us to our fifth anchor point, which is the deliberate integration of clinical anxiety care with spiritual practice. We must confront the deep-seated cultural stigma that falsely tells individuals that seeking professional psychiatric help or using medication is a symptom of spiritual bankruptcy. From a comprehensive psychosomatic perspective, the human mind and the physical brain are inextricably linked, meaning that neurotransmitter imbalances require biological stewardship. True self-compassion involves recognizing that the neural pathways of the brain can become physically damaged by trauma and prolonged stress, just like any other organ in the human body. Seeking the expertise of a licensed clinician or utilizing modern medicine is not an act of cowardice, but a profound expression of wisdom and a responsible management of the biological temple you inhabit. Scriptural principles are never intended to function as an aggressive replacement for professional clinical care, but as a foundational anchor that holds you steady while you do the grueling work of therapy. Once you dismantle the heavy barrier of religious shame surrounding mental health care, your internal world gains the freedom to engage in a highly specific therapeutic practice. This brings us to our sixth anchor point, which focuses on the explicit instruction in verse 6 to make your requests known through precise articulation. Clinical psychology recognizes that generalized anxiety thrives exclusively in a state of ambiguity where the mind fears a vague, terrifying cloud of impending doom. When an individual merely prays or thinks in broad generalities, such as "please help me because I am overwhelmed," the brain remains trapped in its primitive survival response. The ancient blueprint demands a radical act of exposure, requiring you to drag the exact specific worst-case scenario out of the darkness of your subconscious. You must possess the courage to externalize the internal chaos by naming the precise fear, whether it is the fear of bankruptcy, the fear of loneliness, or the fear of death itself. The moment a vague phobia is translated into concrete, specific spoken language, the analytical prefrontal cortex of the brain takes over, reducing the frantic reactivity of the emotional center. This active externalization completely interrupts the internal feedback loop, shifting your role from a helpless victim drowning in a storm to an objective observer cataloging a challenge. This fundamental shift in positioning is beautifully illustrated by an iconic historical narrative involving a terrifying maritime crisis on an ancient sea. This structural parallel brings us to our seventh and final anchor point of the breakdown, which is the dramatic meteorological crisis recorded in the Gospel of Mark chapter 4. As a violent, sudden squall threatens to swamp their fragile wooden vessel, the disciples fall into a state of acute panic characterized by anxious attachment. They wake their sleeping leader and scream a phrase that exposes their deep projection of terror, asking if he genuinely does not care that they are about to perish. Their defense mechanism under extreme stress was to interpret the silence of their mentor as absolute cosmic indifference to their agonizing pain. The profound revelation of this narrative is found in the simple truth that the source of ultimate stability was physically inside the boat before the storm ever began. He did not wait for the environmental conditions to become pristine before offering his calming presence to those who were trembling with fear. Emotional safety is never achieved by sprinting away from the existence of the storm, but by recognizing the immutable character of the anchor that occupies the vessel with you. To fully experience the absolute turning point of this journey, we must unearth the raw linguistic power of the original Greek verb used for guarding, which is phroureo. In the ancient world, this specific term was never used to describe a passive sentimental feeling of warmth or an internal state of quiet, wishful thinking. It was a rigid military designation that specifically referred to a fully armed garrison of battle-tested imperial soldiers deployed to defend an unwalled fortress city. These elite soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder at the perimeter gates, staring directly into the dark valleys below, where enemy forces were actively gathering for an assault. Their formidable physical presence meant that the vulnerable citizens inside the city could sleep in absolute peace because they knew an unbreakable wall of iron was standing between them and the danger. This realization completely shatters the contemporary misconception that scriptural peace is fragile passive emotion that you must somehow manufacture through intense mental discipline. The peace of the Creator is actually a heavy-duty strike team dispatched by the authority of heaven to set up an unyielding perimeter around your vulnerable thoughts. The moment your mind processes the true structural meaning of Phroureo, your entire posture shifts from a trembling target of anxiety to a highly protected citizen of a celestial empire. The unpredictable economic realities, the broken relationships, and the medical uncertainties of your life may still be camping in the valley outside your door. But they have been stripped of their legal authority to breach the gates of your mind or terrorize the core of your identity ever again. Now that this imperial guard has officially taken its position at the gateway of your inner life, you can step down from the watchtower and execute the practical steps of emotional handover. The first actionable behavior you must commit to tonight is the deliberate construction of your own physical history log of past endurance. Sit down with a blank piece of paper and force your mind to document exactly 3 separate instances in your past where you faced an apparently insurmountable wall but somehow survived. The second practical step requires you to look directly into the eyes of your current monster and strip it of its ambiguity by writing down your absolute worst-case scenario in plain, unvarnished words. The third and final step is the ritualistic execution of the psychological handover, where you explicitly state that you are resigning from the position of general manager of the universe. You must tell your overactive mind that you are officially turning the keys of the gate over to the garrison of Phroureo, and then you must physically refuse to run the calculations again. Your worth as a human being is not defined by the chemical sensitivity of your nervous system, or the number of nights you have spent pacing the floor in absolute agony. You are not a broken soul or a second-class believer because your body reacts strongly to the immense pressures of a chaotic, fast-paced contemporary environment. The creator of your soul is intimately familiar with the shallow rhythm of your panicked breathing, the cold sweat on your palms, and the immense fatigue of carrying a family or a career on your solitary shoulders. Tonight, you are fully authorized to let your tense shoulders drop down to their natural position, to cease the endless mental equations, and to rest your weary mind. Your personal vessel is not empty, and the majestic guardian of your inner peace has not fallen asleep on his watch for even a single microsecond. Allow your eyelids to grow heavy and surrender your entire being to a deep, restorative sleep, because the heavy weight you have been trying to carry alone has finally been handed to someone who cannot be broken.